Were Achilles, Odysseus, and Agamemnon real historical figures? Did the famed Trojan horse actually exist? Was the Trojan War a true historical event or merely a product of Homer's imagination? In this video, we'll explore these fascinating questions, examining what archaeology and recently unearthed ancient texts reveal about the events that transpired at the walls of Troy 3,000 years ago. For a long time, the Trojan War and the city of Troy were seen as nothing more than captivating myths. This view changed dramatically in the latter half of the 19th century when Heinrich Schliemann, a self-taught German archaeologist, began excavations on the hill of Hisarlik near Hellespont. Schliemann uncovered the remains of an ancient city at this site. It soon became clear that the hill had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. One city would rise on the ruins of its predecessor, eventually decline and be replaced by another. Archaeologists later classified these cultural layers from Troy 0 to Troy 9. The earliest settlements date back to the early Bronze Age, around 3600 BC. The last city on the hill endured until late antiquity, disappearing only in the 5th century. Heinrich Schliemann's excavation methods, judged by modern standards, were both crude and destructive. In his determination to find the Troy described by Homer, he dug large trenches through the entire hill, destroying invaluable cultural layers and discarding numerous artifacts from later periods, which he considered unimportant. Despite this, Schliemann's work was crucial in demonstrating that Troy was not just a figment of Homer's imagination, but a real city that had endured multiple wars and destructions. Schliemann himself faced challenges in determining which of the layers he uncovered corresponded to Homer's Troy. Believing that the older city would be found deeper, he mistakenly overlooked the cultural layers from the late Bronze Age. Today we recognize that the Homeric period, particularly the late Bronze Age, is represented by the layers known as Troy 6 and Troy 7a, dating from 1750 to 1180 BC. It was at the end of this period, around the transition from the 13th to the 12th century BC, that the Trojan War took place. The city of Troy was divided into two distinct areas: the citadel atop Hisarlik and a sprawling lower city that extended across the hill's slopes and base. The citadel was designed with concentric terraces leading up to the summit, all surrounded by imposing walls made of tightly interlocked stone blocks. These walls were about 5 meters thick and 9 meters high. Rectangular watchtowers rose above them, offering sweeping views of the Trojan plain and the sea. 5 gates punctuated the citadel's walls, opening onto paved roads. Inside, the homes of Trojan nobility featured stone facades and windowless ground floors. Many buildings followed the classic Aegean design of a megaron, a rectangular hall with a portico, though more elaborate structures were also present. At the hill's peak stood the royal palace, which has not survived as most Bronze Age buildings in the area were destroyed during later classical period construction. A significant archaeological discovery in the late 1980s transformed our understanding of Troy. It was previously thought that Troy 6 consisted only of the hilltop citadel. However, excavations uncovered a vast lower city to the south, covering an area of about 75 acres. This discovery significantly changed perceptions of Troy's size, revealing it to be approximately 16 times larger than earlier estimates. In the lower city, archaeologists identified residential quarters, economic buildings, craft areas, and food storage facilities. They unearthed large pithoi used for storing goods, alongside substantial amounts of production waste, indicating a bustling craft industry. Current estimates propose that Troy's population during the late Bronze Age was around 8,000. While this made it a notable and prosperous city for its time, it was still smaller than the major cities of the Hittite Empire. Determining the ethnic identity of Troy's inhabitants is a complex task. The material culture of Troy 6 and Troy 7a closely aligns with that of northwestern Anatolia, yet it also shows a distinct Aegean influence. Initially, the pottery from Troy 6 reflects Aegean styles, but over time, Anatolian motifs became more prevalent. The leading theory suggests that the people of Troy spoke Luwian, an Indo-European language of ancient Anatolia. This hypothesis is supported by the discovery of a clay seal in Troy inscribed with Luwian hieroglyphs. Although a single inscription is not enough to draw firm conclusions, some scholars suggest that the language of Troy may have been similar to that of the nearby island of Lemnos. Another theory proposes that the Trojans may have spoken Greek or a related language. This idea is consistent with Homer's accounts, where Trojans and Greeks seem almost indistinguishable. In his epic tradition, the Trojans understand the Achaeans without difficulty, worship the same gods, and generally share the same cultural sphere as the Greeks. Troy was likely a cosmopolitan hub where various ethnic groups lived together. Intriguingly, the names of Trojan leaders found in Hittite records reveal a mix of linguistic backgrounds. For example, Alexandru resembles the Greek name Alexander. Kukuni is similar to Hittite and Hurrian names, and Walmu has Luwian origins. In Troy, inscriptions have been found on pottery, written in a script that bears a loose resemblance to Linear A and B, as well as the Cypriot linear script. However, these inscriptions are too brief to be fully deciphered. Some scholars claim these markings do not qualify as writing, but this view is likely incorrect. Hittite archives suggest the Trojans were indeed literate. A treaty between the Hittite king and the ruler of Troy has been preserved, with a clause requiring the Trojan king to read the treaty to the public 3 times a year. Another Hittite document notes that the Trojans used wood tablets for writing. Unfortunately, wood deteriorates quickly, especially in the Anatolian climate, making it unlikely that their archives will be found. East of Troy, in central Anatolia, stood one of the great states of the Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire. In Hittite records, Troy is identified by the names Wilusa and Taruisa, which correspond to the Greek names Ilium and Troy. Wilusa first appears in Hittite texts around 1400 BC as part of the Ahhiyawa Confederation, a group of 22 states that resisted Hittite expansion in western Anatolia. The Hittites eventually overcame this coalition, and Wilusa became a vassal state under their control. A treaty between the Hittite king Muwatalli II and the ruler of Wilusa, Alexandru, has survived. This document is significant because Muwatalli mentions a story of relations with Wilusa stretching back over 3 centuries to the time of Hattusili I. The text reveals that the rulers of Wilusa and the Hittite kings maintained diplomatic contact and exchanged envoys for hundreds of years. The treaty required Alexandru to pay tribute to the Hittites, provide intelligence, and supply troops for their military campaigns. Among the deities listed as guarantors of the treaty was Apollonius, whose name bears a striking resemblance to the Greek god Apollo. In exchange for their allegiance, the Hittites offered military support to the Trojans, a vital alliance given Troy's frequent entanglement in conflicts. Troy, a formidable state with numerous allies in northwestern Anatolia, often managed to defend itself. However, when a coalition of several Greek city-states rose against them, Troy's situation became dire. In such moments, Hittite intervention was crucial. The strategic location of Troy, near the Hellespont, a key maritime passage connecting the Aegean and Black Seas, was a fundamental cause of the conflicts in the region. The strait was historically a crucial trade route, and controlling it promised substantial commercial benefits. Records from Hittite archives document the ongoing struggle for control over this passage. Several letters describe disputes between the Hittite kings and the rulers of Ahhiyawa. Although the exact identity of Ahhiyawa remains debated, most Hittitologists believe it referred to the Mycenaean Greeks. In the Hattusa archives, Ahhiyawa is portrayed as a powerful maritime nation located west of Anatolia. The kings of Ahhiyawa often interfered in the affairs of western Anatolian states, including Wilusa. One particularly revealing document shows a Hittite king addressing the ruler of Ahhiyawa as his brother. For the Hittites, this was not just a formality, it was a title reserved for great kings they considered equals, such as the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Babylon and Assyria. Tensions over Wilusa existed before the Trojan War. The Achaeans occasionally launched attacks to gain control of the strait. These ancient conflicts are also reflected in Greek mythology. For example, one myth recounts that even before the events of the Iliad, Heracles had already sacked Troy once. This allows us to piece together a detailed narrative. For over 2 centuries, from the 14th to the 12th century BC, Wilusa was dominated by the Hittite Empire and frequently became the center of political and military clashes between the Hittites and the Greek Achaeans. The repeated destruction of ancient Troy serves as a silent witness to those long-standing conflicts. In the mid-13th century BC, the Hittites, Achaeans, and Troy were part of a relatively stable international system. They engaged in conflicts, forged treaties, intervened in one another's affairs, and vied for influence in western Anatolia. But this equilibrium was soon shattered. The world began a rapid decline, foreshadowing the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, one of ancient history's most significant catastrophes. Although the main events of this crisis occurred in the early 12th century BC, warning signs appeared much earlier. Within the Hittite Empire, internal strife and political instability grew. One by one, dependent territories and satellite states broke away, weakening central authority. Severe droughts led to crop failures and famine, while new and unfamiliar peoples appeared at the borders, bringing death and destruction. During this period, tensions between Troy and the Achaeans flared up once again. A powerful coalition of Mycenaean cities gathered to confront Troy, echoing the legendary tale later captured by Homer in the Iliad. In earlier times, Troy could count on support from the Hittites. However, the Hittite Empire was now engulfed in its greatest crisis, leaving Troy to face the looming threat on its own. Homer tells us that the siege lasted for 10 years. However, in practical terms, this seems unlikely, as no Bronze Age city could withstand a decade-long blockade without food supplies. Moreover, archaeological studies of Homeric Troy indicate evidence of at least 2 sieges before its ultimate destruction. The initial Greek expedition seems to have ended with a truce that lasted for a considerable period, suggesting that the siege was primarily fought on land, or that there were long pauses between battles. After this, hostilities ceased and the Achaeans returned home. How do we know this? Archaeologists have found evidence of combat, such as arrowheads and spearheads embedded into the walls, along with signs of localized fires within the city. However, there's no evidence of complete destruction or widespread looting. Moreover, it's clear that the walls of Troy were damaged but later repaired, indicating that the city's inhabitants had enough time and resources to calmly restore their defenses. It seems that the initial siege ended with the Greeks' withdrawal, though the reasons remain unclear. Perhaps the Trojans managed to defeat the Achaeans on the battlefield. Alternatively, Troy might have paid a ransom to the Greeks, or the Greeks could have faced supply issues, forcing them to abandon the siege. Regardless, there was a break between the 2 phases of the conflict. After some time, the Achaeans returned, launching a new siege that ultimately led to the capture and destruction of Troy. Today, more researchers are inclined to believe that the Homeric epic is based on a series of sieges, raids, and battles around Troy, spanning decades and culminating in the city's destruction. Over time, these conflicts merged in Greek memory into this singular grand narrative of the Trojan War. Exploring the elements of the Homeric epic reveals the Trojan horse as an iconic emblem of the Trojan War. While many theories attempt to explain its true nature, none suggest it was literally a wooden statue filled with soldiers. One interpretation proposes that the horse was actually a siege engine. In ancient times, military machines were often named after animals. For example, the onager means wild donkey. The Assyrians would protect their siege engines with wet hides from bulls and horses to guard against flaming arrows. It's conceivable that the Greeks used a similar strategy during the siege of Troy, and later storytellers, perhaps misunderstanding the original concept, turned it into the legend of a giant horse. Even in the 2nd century AD, the geographer Pausanias described the horse as a device for breaching the Trojan wall, noting that this was apparent to anyone who didn't consider the Trojans completely naive. Another theory suggests that the horse was actually a ship. Scholars have noted that the verbs used by ancient Greek authors to describe warriors boarding the horse are the same as those used for embarking onto a ship. In the Odyssey, ships are called sea horses, Merchant vessels with prows shaped like a horse's head, known as hippos, were common in the Aegean world. According to this theory, Greek warriors hid in the hold of such a ship, disguised as a gift from the defeated, and through the oral retelling of this story, the ship horse transformed into a wooden horse. The third interpretation proposes that the horse symbolized natural forces. According to this perspective, Troy's walls were breached by a devastating earthquake followed by a tsunami, allowing the Greeks to enter the city. In this scenario, the horse represents Poseidon, who is revered not only as the god of the sea, but also as the deity of horses and earthquakes. Archaeological findings support this theory. Excavations have shown that Troy 6 suffered significant earthquake damage. Although the city was reconstructed, most of the remaining inhabitants moved within the citadel, and some gates were closed, suggesting defensive preparations. This event, though not directly tied to sieges, may have persisted in Greek memory, eventually transforming into the legend of the Trojan horse as a metaphor for natural forces that assisted the Greeks in their triumph. In examining the characters of the Trojan War, it's important to note that none can be definitively classified as historical figures. However, this does not necessarily mean they were purely fictional. It's plausible that some of Homer's heroes were inspired by real individuals. The difficulty lies in the lack of compelling evidence to conclusively identify any of them as specific historical persons. Nevertheless, some intriguing parallels can be drawn. In Hittite records, certain names closely resemble characters from the Iliad. The most compelling example is Paris. In Homer's epic, he is the Trojan prince who abducts Helen of Troy, the wife of the Spartan king, igniting the war. In Hittite archives, there is a mention of a ruler of Wilusa named Alexandru. Homer also refers to Paris as Alexander. Moreover, Alexandru's reign roughly coincides with the final years of Troy's existence. Can we confidently equate Homer's Paris with the Hittite Alexandru? Not definitively. However, it is plausible that they might be the same person. Several factors align: the name, the era, the location, and the connection to the royal house of Troy. The situation involving King Priam of Troy, father of Paris, is considerably more complex. In the Hittite archives, a figure named Pia-Maradu is indeed mentioned. He appears in multiple documents and is involved in numerous military conflicts in western Anatolia during the period just before the fall of Troy. However, identifying Pia-Maradu with Homer's Priam is fraught with significant doubts. In the Hittite text, Pia-Maradu is not directly linked to Wilusa. Furthermore, he did not originate from Troy, but rather from Arzawa, or another western Hittite province. Hittite records portray him as an independent and formidable warlord who conducted raids in various regions, including Troy itself. Nevertheless, the name Pia-Maradu does bear a resemblance to Priam. It is conceivable that memories of a real military leader from the late Bronze Age gradually became intertwined with oral traditions about Troy and its rulers. Such transformations in oral epic traditions are common, where historical events, names, and characters become interwoven, reinterpreted, and merged over time. The situation surrounding Agamemnon is shrouded in uncertainty. In Homer's epic, he's depicted as the quintessential warrior king, leading the charge against Troy. Numerous archaeological artifacts bear his name, such as the famous Mask of Agamemnon and the so-called Tomb of Agamemnon in Mycenae. However, these labels were assigned much later and are largely symbolic. In reality, there's no direct evidence confirming the historical existence of a king named Agamemnon. Archaeological findings reveal that Mycenae was an exceptionally powerful state during the late Bronze Age, marked by strong royal authority. The presence of grand palaces, cyclopean walls, lavish burials, and evidence of a sophisticated administrative system all attest to this. It's likely that the king of Mycenae was the one whom the Hittite king referred to as his brother. It's plausible that the ruler of Mycenae could indeed have led a coalition of Achaean states. Notably, Homer's poetic descriptions of Mycenae generally align well with archaeological findings. Nevertheless, this does not conclusively prove the existence of a specific king named Agamemnon. There is no doubt that Mycenae had a formidable ruler, but whether his name was Agamemnon remains unknown. The situation regarding Agamemnon's father, Atreus, offers a different perspective. There is at least one compelling candidate for a historical counterpart. In Hittite text from around 1400 BC, an Achaean leader named Atarsia is noted for his military campaigns in western Anatolia and a raid on Cyprus. The Hittite document known as the Indictment of Maduwata describes him as a formidable commander, leading a force of 100 chariots and 1,000 infantrymen. The linguistic link between Atarsia and Atreus seems quite plausible. Yet even if this connection is valid, it doesn't necessarily mean that Atarsia is the same as the legendary Atreus. Hittite records place him about 2 generations before the Trojan War, which still fits the timeline for Agamemnon's ancestor. Now let's focus on the central figure of the Trojan War, Achilles. Unlike Paris or Priam, his name does not appear in Hittite records. However, several Mycenaean tablets from the end of the Bronze Age contain names that bear a striking resemblance. Achireu and Achireve. In later ancient Greek, some consonant sounds shifted, transforming Achireu into Achileu and Achireve into Achileve. While these tablets do not provide definitive evidence of Homer's Achilles as a historical figure, they do highlight an intriguing fact. A name resembling Achilles was indeed in use during the late Bronze Age. This suggests that the character of Achilles might be based on the memory of a real person, not the demigod or immortal hero depicted in the epic, but rather an extraordinary warrior whose deeds resonated through time. As stories were passed down orally over the centuries, the memory of this warrior transformed into the legend of the greatest hero of the Trojan War. The Trojan War was indeed a historical event. Archaeological findings confirm that Troy existed and was destroyed in warfare, while Hittite texts document prolonged conflicts around Wilusa involving the Achaeans and Anatolians. However, the world Homer portrays is not a historical account. It's a reflection of late Bronze Age events shaped by centuries of oral tradition, myth, and poetry. This enduring fascination with the Trojan War, even after 3 millennia, stems from its blend of legend, gods, and heroes, which still conceals the remnants of a real catastrophe experienced by the people at the end of the Bronze Age. If you made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations and history. If you'd like to support the channel, join our Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. You get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes looks, and more. You can also leave a super thanks below to give us a little extra boost. If you want to listen to history on the go, check out our all-new podcast, Parabellum History. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.